My brother staged an intervention to steal my inheritance while I was grieving our father's death. He thought I was unstable and weak, so I let him believe it while I set a trap that would cost him everything. The family thought they were saving me. They had no idea I was about to save our father's legacy from him. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The scent of stale coffee and lilies hung heavy in the air of my mother's living room. It was the smell of grief, an aroma that had clung to us for the 2 weeks since Dad's funeral. I sat on the floral sofa, the one Dad had always complained was too soft, and clutched a mug of lukewarm tea. My exhaustion was bone-deep, a hollowed-out feeling that had less to do with a lack of sleep, and more to do with the gaping hole Dad's absence had left in my world. My eyes felt gritty. My thoughts moved through my mind like fish in muddy water, and all I wanted was to go home to my quiet apartment and be alone. My brother Julian sat opposite me in Dad's old leather armchair, looking infuriatingly composed. His suit was perfectly pressed, his hair impeccably styled. He projected an aura of calm authority that had always set my teeth on edge. Our mother, Helen, was perched on the edge of her seat, wringing her hands, her gaze darting between us. My aunt and uncle, invited under some vague pretense, completed the circle, their expressions a mixture of pity and concern. "Andrea," Julian began, his voice smooth and measured, the kind of tone he used with difficult clients. "We're all here because we love you. We're worried about you." I blinked slowly, trying to process his words. Worried about what? My own voice sounded raspy, distant. "Your behavior," he said, letting the word hang in the air. "Since the funeral, the late nights, the drinking, we think you're not coping well." I stared at him, my mind struggling to connect his accusation with my reality. Late nights? I was an architect, and we were in the middle of a major project bid. I had been working until 2 in the morning most nights, fueled by caffeine and the desperate need for a distraction. The drinking? I'd had a glass of wine with a colleague after a particularly grueling day. Once. Was that what this was about? "I'm grieving, Julian," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We all are. I've been working. It's helping me keep my mind occupied." "That's what you call it," he pressed, leaning forward. "Our cousin saw you out last week. At that loud bar downtown, he said you were a mess." A hot flush of anger rose up my neck. My cousin, a notorious gossip, had seen me at a networking event for my firm. I had been there for an hour, spoken to 3 potential clients, and nursed a single club soda. "That was a work event," I said, my voice gaining a harder edge. "You know that. I told you about the Henderson project." My mother made a soft, distressed sound. "Honey, please just listen. Your brother showed me your social media. All those pictures from galas and parties." "Those are from months ago, Mom. Industry awards. Charity fundraisers Dad and I used to go to together." I felt a frantic desperation clawing at my throat. They were twisting my life into something unrecognizable, a caricature of a wild, out-of-control party girl. I was a 42-year-old woman who designed buildings for a living and whose idea of a wild night was falling asleep while reading blueprints. Julian stood up and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back like a prosecuting attorney delivering his closing argument. "We've found a place for you, Andrea. A wonderful facility. Peaceful. It's in the countryside. They can help you process your grief in a healthy way. Get you away from the temptations of the city." The word hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Rehab. They were staging an intervention. They wanted to send me to rehab. The room began to feel small, the air thin. My aunt was nodding sagely, my uncle looking at me with sad, disappointed eyes. They believed him. Every single one of them believed his poisonous narrative. I looked from face to face, searching for a flicker of doubt, a sign that someone saw the absurdity of the situation. I found nothing but earnest, misguided concern, all of it orchestrated by the man in the tailored suit. He had painted a picture of me as unstable, and they had all willingly picked up a brush and helped him color it in. The true reason for this theater of cruelty suddenly slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about my well-being. It was about the inheritance. Dad's will was to be read in 2 weeks. His most significant asset was his architectural firm, the one he had built from the ground up, the one I had worked at alongside him for 15 years. Julia. N, a wealth manager, had always been resentful of the firm, viewing it as a tangible symbol of the bond I shared with our father, a bond he never had. If I were deemed unstable, institutionalized, he could petition for control. The realization was a shard of ice in my gut. This wasn't an act of love. It was a corporate takeover staged in a living room using family as leverage. My grief, my exhaustion, my professional life, all of it had been weaponized against me by my own brother. The shock was so profound, so gut-wrenching, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. My family, my own mother, was siding with him, convinced they were saving me when they were actually helping him bury me. I stood up, my legs shaking but my spine rigid. Their faces turned to me, expectant, hopeful that I would break down, confess, and gratefully accept their help. I looked directly at Julian, whose expression was a perfect mask of compassion, but I could see the cold, calculating glint in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought I was broken. The betrayal was worse than the grief itself. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and smeared cityscapes seen through a film of unshed tears. I didn't cry. The shock had frozen the tears somewhere in my chest, a heavy, painful lump that made it hard to breathe. Inside my apartment, the silence was absolute. The sleek, minimalist space I'd designed to be my sanctuary now felt like a pristine cage. I walked through the rooms, tracing my fingers over the cool marble of the kitchen island, the smooth wood of my drafting table. Everything was in its place, a testament to a life of order and control, the very life they had just tried to declare a chaotic mess. My phone buzzed on the counter, jolting me from my stupor. It was my mother. I stared at her name on the screen, a wave of nausea rolling over me. With a trembling hand, I answered. "Andrea, are you all right, dear?" Her voice was laced with a feigned, wobbly concern that made my stomach clench. "I'm fine, Mom," I said, my tone flat and cold. "You left so abruptly. We were all just so worried. Julian is sitting here right now. He's just beside himself with anxiety over you." I could almost see it. Julian, sitting in Dad's armchair, performing his role as the burdened, caring brother. The image was so repulsive I had to close my eyes. "Was he?" I asked, the words dripping with an irony she would completely miss. "Yes, he's the one who organized this, you know. He's been researching the best facilities for weeks. He only wants what's best for you, for all of us. He thinks if you could just get some help, you'd be in a much better position to handle, well, everything that's coming." Everything that's coming. The will reading. She had laid it bare without even realizing it. Julian wasn't just concerned, he was strategizing. This intervention was his opening move in a game I hadn't even known we were playing. He was positioning me as an unreliable variable that needed to be neutralized before the final accounting. "Mom," I said, my voice low and steady, "I am not going to a facility. There is nothing wrong with me. I am grieving my father and I am managing a demanding career. That is all." "But Andrea, your brother said." "I know what my brother said," I cut in, my patience snapping. "And you chose to believe him. You didn't call me, you didn't ask me. You sat there and listened to him twist my life into a lie and you nodded along." There was a sniffle on the other end of the line. "It's just so hard seeing you like this. Your father's passing has been difficult on us all." She was retreating into her own grief, using it as a shield to absolve herself of her complicity. She wasn't malicious like Julian. She was just weak, easily led by the child who projected the most confidence. Today, that had been Julian. I ended the call without another word, my heart aching with a fresh layer of pain. My own mother had been convinced to see me not as a grieving daughter, but as a problem to be solved. I sank onto my sofa, the events of the afternoon replaying in a horrifying loop, the circle of concerned faces, Julian's smooth, poisonous words, the suffocating sense of being trapped and judged by the very people who were supposed to be my anchor. A cold fury began to seep into the cracks of my shock, solidifying into something hard and sharp. Julian had made a critical miscalculation. He had mistaken my grief for weakness. He assumed I would crumble under the weight of his ambush. He saw me as an emotional, fragile artist, not as the architect I truly was, a planner, a designer, a builder. Someone who understood structure, stress points, and foundations. He thought he was demolishing my reputation, but he had only laid the groundwork for his own downfall. As I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the first blueprints of a counterplan began to form in my mind. He had used our family to build his case against me. It was a flaw. Design built on a foundation of lies, and I knew exactly where its weaknesses were. I knew how to bring the whole structure down. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Julian. "Andrea, please reconsider. We are doing this from a place of love. Don't shut us out." I stared at the message, the word love seeming profane in this context. He was still playing his part, documenting his concern for the record. Fine, let him. Let them all think I was hurt, confused, and isolated. Let them think I was spiraling. The more they underestimated me, the more stunning their surprise would be. Julian and my mother, in their calculated campaign, had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten who I was, who Dad had raised me to be, and most importantly, what I knew. My father, Robert, was a man who lived and breathed architecture. He didn't just design buildings. He understood them as living entities, with bones of steel and concrete and a soul made of light and space. Our home wasn't just a house, it was a classroom. From the time I could hold a pencil, he was teaching me about load-bearing walls, the importance of a solid foundation, and the elegant mathematics of a well-designed arch. While Julian was inside playing with video games, Dad and I were in his workshop, building intricate models, our hands dusty with plaster and glue. Julian never understood it. He saw the firm, Sterling Designs, as a machine that printed money, not as a legacy of creativity and integrity. When he went into finance, Dad had been quietly disappointed but supportive. Julian was obsessed with metrics, with profit margins and quarterly earnings. He spoke of assets and leveraging, words that felt alien in the context of Dad's work, which was about beauty and function. I, on the other hand, had followed in Dad's footsteps without a second thought. Working beside him for 15 years had been the greatest joy of my life. We were partners in every sense of the word. He trusted my vision, and I respected his experience. Together, we had made Sterling Designs one of the most respected boutique firms in the country. My devotion to the firm was absolute. After his diagnosis, I took on more and more responsibility, working tirelessly to ensure the business would not just survive his absence, but thrive. I managed projects, I mentored junior architects, and I spent countless nights poring over contracts and bids, all while trying to cherish the dwindling time I had left with my father. My social life, which had never been particularly wild, narrowed to the occasional dinner with close friends or industry events that were essential for networking. Julian had taken this life of dedication and sacrifice and twisted it into a narrative of reckless abandon. I remember a conversation a few months before Dad passed. Julian had come to the family home for Sunday dinner, a rare occurrence. He found me in Dad's study, reviewing a complex proposal for a new museum wing. "Still at it, Andy?" he'd said, leaning against the doorframe, a smug smile on his face. He was the only one who still used that childish nickname, and I knew he did it to diminish me. "This is a huge opportunity for the firm, Julian," I'd replied, not looking up from the blueprints. The firm," he sighed dramatically. "Don't you ever do anything else? You should get out more, live a little. All this work is making you tense." He gestured around the room, at the shelves filled with architectural books and rolled-up plans. "You know, Dad's portfolio is a mess. All these properties tied up in the business, it's an inefficient way to manage wealth. Once I'm in charge of the estate, I have some ideas for how to liquidate and reinvest for a much better return." I had finally looked up then, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "You're not in charge of the estate, Julian. The firm is Dad's legacy. It's not a collection of assets to be liquidated." His smile tightened. "We'll see what the will says, and we'll see who is best equipped to manage things, a sentimental artist or a professional wealth manager." He had a polished, almost unnervingly smooth demeanor. His suits were always designer, his watch was ostentatious, and he spoke with a carefully cultivated confidence designed to make others feel small. He was a master of the backhanded compliment and the concern-sounding insult. He could make a question like, "Are you feeling all right?" "You look tired," sound like a medical diagnosis. This was the man who had orchestrated my intervention. A man who saw our father's life's work as a spreadsheet and his own sister as an obstacle. His interest in my well-being was a complete fabrication, a tool for his own enrichment. The memory of that conversation in the study now felt like a declaration of war I had been too naive to recognize at the time. He had been planning this for months, laying the groundwork, waiting for the perfect moment of vulnerability to strike. My father's death had provided him with that moment. The antagonist wasn't just my brother, it was his entire worldview. He represented a cold, transactional approach to life and family that was the antithesis of everything my father had stood for. Dad built things to last. Julian only knew how to break things down and sell them for parts. He had no respect for the history, the artistry, or the human element of sterling designs. In his eyes, I wasn't just his sister. I was a sentimental fool standing in the way of progress and profit. The more I thought about it, the clearer his plan became. It wasn't just about getting a larger share, it was about total control. He wanted to dismantle our father's legacy and rebuild it in his own image, and he was willing to destroy my reputation and my relationship with our family to do it. But his polished exterior hid a fatal flaw: arrogance. He was so convinced of his own intelligence that he couldn't imagine anyone, least of all his emotional little sister, could ever outsmart him. The morning after the intervention, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The fog of grief had been burned away by the cold fire of anger. The passive victim of yesterday was gone. In her place was an architect with a new, deeply personal project: to design the perfect trap for her brother. My first call was not to my mother or to Julian, but to David Chen. David had been our family's estate lawyer for over a decade and had worked closely with my father. More than that, he was a friend. He was sharp, meticulous, and possessed a quiet integrity that was the polar opposite of my brother's slick charisma. "David, it's Andrea Sterling," I said when he answered. "Andrea, my condolences again about your father. I was so sorry to hear. How are you holding up?" "That's actually why I'm calling," I said, taking a deep breath. "Something has happened. My brother, he staged an intervention for me yesterday." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "He did what?" I quickly recounted the entire humiliating ordeal: Julian's accusations, my mother's complicity, the talk of a facility, and my stark realization about his motives concerning the inheritance. I left nothing out. When I was finished, David let out a low whistle. "That's not just ruthless, Andrea. It's brazen," he said, his voice now laced with professional steel. "Julian is making a play for control, and he's trying to establish a record of your supposed instability. It's a classic, if despicable, tactic." "I know," I said, "but I think he's forgotten something. Dad and I talked a lot about the will in his final year. We made some specific provisions. Do you remember the clause we added to Section 7? I could hear the faint rustle of papers as David pulled up the file. "Section 7? Ah, yes, the fiduciary integrity clause. Robert was very insistent on this one. I remember the conversation well." My father, bless his forward-thinking soul, had worried about Julian's transactional nature. He feared that after he was gone, Julian might try to pressure me into selling the firm or making other decisions that prioritized short-term cash over long-term legacy. Together, he, David, and I had drafted a special clause. It was designed to protect the firm and my role in it. David read it aloud, his voice crisp and clear. "Should any named beneficiary be found to have engaged in malicious, deceptive, or fraudulent actions, with the intent to unjustly diminish another beneficiary's standing or character for the purpose of financial gain, the offending beneficiary shall forfeit their claim to any and all shares of Sterling Designs, LLC. A slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. He's forgotten it, David. I am certain of it. He's so blinded by his own greed and arrogance that he's walked right into a trap Dad and I set for him years ago. This is more than a trap, Andrea. This is a fortress, David said, a hint of admiration in his tone. But we need more than suspicion. To invoke this clause, we need irrefutable proof of his intent. We need to build a case. This was the turning point. My grief and shock morphed into focused, strategic resolve. I was no longer on the defensive. I was on the attack. David and I laid out a plan. The first step was to gather evidence. I started with my phone. Julian's concerned texts were the first piece. Then I called the cousin he'd mentioned, the one who had supposedly seen me being a mess at the bar. After some initial hedging, my cousin admitted that Julian had called him, fishing for dirt, twisting his innocuous observation into something ugly. He made it sound like you were doing something wrong, Andrea. I'm so sorry, he'd said. I asked him if he would be willing to sign a sworn statement to that effect. He agreed. Next, David suggested we look into Julian's finances. A move this desperate is often born of desperation, he explained. Apple don't risk blowing up their family for sport. David engaged a discreet financial investigator. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. Julian wasn't the successful wealth manager he pretended to be. He had made a series of high-risk, catastrophic investments with his clients' money, and he was on the verge of being exposed. He was deep in debt, his lavish lifestyle a house of cards about to collapse. He wasn't just trying to get a bigger piece of the inheritance, he needed it. He needed to liquidate the firm's assets to cover his own massive financial holes. The inheritance wasn't a windfall for him, it was a lifeline. The pieces were locking into place, the blueprint of his betrayal becoming clearer with every new discovery. He wasn't just greedy, he was cornered, and cornered animals are predictable. They lash out, they get sloppy. And Julian had gotten very, very sloppy. All I had to do now was let him continue to think he was in control, right up until the moment I pulled the rug out from under him. The will reading was in 10 days. The clock was ticking. With a growing file of evidence, I knew I couldn't wait until the official will reading to make my first move. Julian's narrative of my instability was spreading through the family like a virus, and I needed to introduce an antidote. I needed to sow the first seeds of doubt in my mother's mind. A direct assault wouldn't work. She would just see it as me being defensive. I had to be more subtle. I had to be an architect, carefully removing one support beam at a time until the structure of Julian's lies began to wobble. I called my mother and invited her to lunch at a quiet restaurant, one she and I used to frequent. I told her I was ready to talk, a phrase I knew she would interpret as a sign of my surrender. She agreed immediately, her voice filled with relief. She arrived looking anxious, ready to deliver another gentle lecture on the benefits of seeking help. I let her talk, nodding patiently as she spoke about the importance of family and how much Julian was sacrificing to try and help me. I let her exhaust her talking points until she finally wound down, looking at me expectantly. I understand you're all worried, I began, my voice calm and measured. I didn't sound angry or hysterical. I sounded reasonable. And I've been doing a lot of thinking. I know my behavior might seem erratic. Working so hard, being out at that industry event. Maybe it does look like I'm not coping. Her expression softened. This was what she wanted to hear. Oh, honey, it's okay. We just want to help. I know, I said. And I appreciate Julian going to all this trouble. It must have taken a lot of his time, and I know how busy he is, especially with everything going on at his firm. I paused, letting that last sentence hang in the air. My mother frowned slightly. What do you mean? He said business is booming. I took a slow sip of water. That's strange. I heard something different. A friend of mine works in finance, and she mentioned that Julian's biggest client, the Henderson Group, just pulled their entire portfolio from his management. Apparently, they were unhappy with the returns. It's all over the financial blogs, she said. This was a carefully curated piece of information from the investigator's report. It was true, and it was public record if you knew where to look. Helen's face clouded with confusion. He didn't say anything about that. He just bought a new car. Did he? I feigned mild surprise. Well, I'm sure it's nothing. He's brilliant with money, after all. It's just odd. Liquidating a major client portfolio can trigger all sorts of internal reviews. It can get messy. I let my voice trail off as if I were simply thinking aloud. I had placed the first stone in her shoe. It was a small, nagging doubt, but it was there. I could see it in the way her gaze unfocused, her mind clearly replaying her recent conversations with Julian through this new lens. Was his desperation to help me connected to this? Was his confidence a facade? I saw my chance to place another. You know, it's funny, I continued, in a conversational tone. The facility he suggested, it's a wonderful place. It's also incredibly expensive. Did he mention how we would pay for it? He said he would take care of it, she replied quickly. From the estate. From the estate, I repeated slowly, letting the implication settle. But the estate isn't settled yet. The will hasn't even been read. To do that, he'd have to petition the court for an advance against my inheritance, based on the idea that I'm unwell. It's a huge legal undertaking. Her eyes widened. She was a smart woman, but not financially or legally savvy. She had taken Julian's words at face value. Now, presented with the practical, complicated reality of what he was proposing, she looked uncertain. Just then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian. Mom told me you're having lunch. I hope you. Ray listening to reason, Andrea. This is for your own good. The audacity of it, the constant monitoring and manipulation, sent a fresh jolt of anger through me, but I kept my expression serene. I showed the text to my mother. He's very persistent, I said simply. Seeing the message, combined with the doubts I had just planted, had a visible effect on her. Her posture drooped. The confident, concerned parent who had walked into the restaurant was being replaced by a confused and worried woman. She was caught between her two children, and for the first time, she was no longer sure who was telling the truth. I didn't push any further. I had done what I came to do. I changed the subject, asking her about her garden, and we finished the meal with strained but polite conversation. When we parted ways on the sidewalk, she hugged me, but it was different. It was hesitant, searching. Andrea, she said quietly, just be careful. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. The united front Julian had so carefully constructed was beginning to crack. He had expected me to fight him head-on, to scream and cry and prove his point. Instead, I had presented calm, undeniable facts that challenged the very foundation of his story. His reaction, I knew, would be to lash out. He would see this not as a sign to back down, but as a reason to escalate. And that was exactly what I was counting on. Julian's reaction was swifter and more aggressive than I had even anticipated. The moment my mother conveyed her newfound doubts to him, he doubled down. He began calling other family members, aunts, uncles, distant cousins, feeding them an even more dramatic version of his story. He claimed I'd become hostile and paranoid, that I was making wild accusations about his business to deflect from my own problems. He was trying to completely isolate me, to paint me as the unstable person at the center of a storm of my own making. It was a desperate, panicked move, and it was a mistake. While he was busy poisoning the well with relatives, David and I were cementing our case. The financial investigator's full report came in, and it was damning. Julian wasn't just in debt, he was on the brink of ruin. He had used funds from one client to cover losses from another, a dangerous game that was about to blow up in his face. He owed a massive debt to a private lender, and the payment was due 1 week after the scheduled will reading. The inheritance wasn't just a lifeline, it was the only thing that could save him from professional disgrace and potential legal action. His motive was now crystal clear and thoroughly documented. Then David got a call from my cousin, the one Julian had tried to recruit. He was feeling increasingly guilty. He forwarded David the entire text exchange he'd had with Julian. The messages were explicit. Julian had written, "I need you to say you saw Andrea looking unstable at that bar. It's for her own good, but also for the family. We need to protect the estate from her impulsive decisions." It was the smoking gun. He had stated his intent to protect the estate in writing. With this final piece of evidence, I knew it was time to confront my mother again. This time, there would be no subtlety. She needed to see the unvarnished truth before the will reading, before she publicly sided with Julian and embarrassed herself. I went to her house, my heart heavy. This was going to hurt her, and I took no pleasure in it. I found her in the garden, listlessly pruning her roses. She looked tired and stressed. "Mom, we need to talk," I said, my voice gentle but firm. She sighed, putting down her shears. "Andrea, I don't know what to believe. Julian says you're turning against him, that you're not well." "No," I said, cutting her off. "I am not going to let you hide behind that excuse anymore. You are not a bystandable in this. You are my mother, and you need to listen. Not to Julian's lies, not to my supposed paranoia, but to the facts." I sat her down at the kitchen table and laid everything out. I didn't raise my voice. I presented the information calmly, methodically, like I was presenting a design to a client. I showed her the summary of the financial investigator's report. I showed her the printout of the text messages between Julian and our cousin. She read the texts, her hand trembling. The line about protecting the estate from my impulsive decisions made her gasp. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. The carefully constructed image of her loving, concerned son was shattering before her very eyes. He lied," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "All of it." "All of it, Mom," I said softly. "He's in trouble, deep trouble. He needs money, and he was willing to destroy my reputation to get it. He used your love and your worry as a weapon against me." The tears she had been holding back finally came, silent tears that streamed down her face. She wasn't crying for Julian or for hers. Elf, she was crying for me, for her failure to protect me, for her willingness to believe the worst. "Oh, Andrea," she sobbed, reaching across the table to grab my hand. "What have I done? What did I let him do?" "It's not too late," I assured her, my own eyes stinging. "You know the truth now, that's what matters." I explained the clause in Dad's will, the one designed for this exact scenario. Her expression shifted from anguish to a flicker of awe. "Your father," she said, a watery smile touching her lips. "He always knew. He was always 3 steps ahead." "Yes, he was," I said, "and now we are going to see his wishes through." We sat together for a long time, the afternoon sun slanting through the kitchen window. The air between us, which had been thick with suspicion and hurt, was finally clear. She asked questions, and I answered them. She apologized, and I accepted. It wasn't a magic fix, and the hurt would take time to heal, but our foundation, which Julian had tried so hard to demolish, was beginning to be repaired. Now we were a united front. Julian had no idea. He still thought our mother was his pawn, that I was isolated and teetering on the edge. He was walking into the will reading expecting to deliver the final blow. He had no clue that he was the one walking into a perfectly designed, inescapable trap. The day of the will reading arrived, overcast and gray, the sky matching the somber mood I had anticipated for weeks. We convened in David Chen's spacious, wood-paneled conference room. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft lighting. I sat on one side with my mother, who gave my hand a reassuring squeeze beneath the table. On the other side sat Julian, flanked by our aunt and uncle, who still looked at me with expressions of pity. Julian himself was the picture of confidence, offering my mother and me a tight, condescending smile. He thought our sitting together was a sign that my mother had finally convinced me to accept his help. David Chen entered the room, his face impassive, and took his seat at the head of the table. He cleared his throat and began the formal proceedings, his voice a steady, calming presence in the tense room. He started with the smaller bequests, personal items left to friends and distant relatives. My heart pounded against my ribs, a slow, heavy drumbeat marking the time until the main event. Finally, David arrived at the section concerning the primary assets, the family home, the investment portfolio, and the centerpiece of it all, Sterling Designs. As per Robert's instructions, David said, looking up from the document, the liquid assets and the family home are to be divided equally between his two children, Andrea and Julian. Julian nodded, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. This was just as he'd expected. However, David continued, his gaze sharpening, the matter of Sterling Designs, LLC, is more complex. He looked pointedly at Julian. Before we proceed with the disposition of the firm, Julian, I understand you have a concern you wish to raise regarding your sister's fitness to manage her inheritance. This was it, the moment of truth. Julian straightened his tie, his expression shifting to one of solemn gravity. "Thank you, David," he said, his voice oozing false sincerity. "This is incredibly difficult for me, but as my father's son, I have a duty to protect his legacy. I am formally petitioning the estate to have Andrea's portion of the inheritance, specifically her controlling interest in the firm, placed into a discretionary trust managed by an independent trustee." He paused for dramatic effect. "I have reason to believe that my sister is not well. Her recent behavior, her erratic work hours, her excessive socializing, her paranoia indicates she is not in a stable position to manage a multi-million-dollar company. We tried to get her help, but she refused. I am concerned she will run the firm into the ground. I have documents here, statements from family members, outlining these concerns." He slid a folder across the table toward David. David didn't even glance at it. Instead, he looked at me. "Andrea, do you have a response?" I took a deep breath. All eyes were on me. Julian looked poised for a victory he believed was moments away. Our aunt and uncle looked on, their faces etched with worry. My mother watched me with quiet strength. "Yes, I do," I said, my voice clear and strong, without a hint of the instability Julian had worked so hard to manufacture. "My brother is correct about one thing. He does have a duty to protect our father's legacy. A duty he has failed in the most profound way possible." I turned to Julian. "You're not concerned about my health. You're concerned about your debts. You're not trying to protect the firm. You're trying to liquidate it to cover the disastrous losses you've incurred from your own reckless investments." Julian's face went pale, the smirk vanished. "This is absurd. She's delusional." David, you see." "Am I?" I asked calmly. I placed my own folder on the table. "In this folder, you will find a full report from a financial investigator detailing your near bankruptcy. You will also find a sworn statement from our cousin, admitting you pressured him to lie about my behavior. And most damningly, you will find printouts of your own text messages to him, stating your intent to protect the estate from my impulsive decisions." As I spoke, David methodically passed copies of the documents to everyone at the table, including my shocked aunt and uncle. Julian stared at the text messages, his face ashen. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was caught. David let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final, decisive blow. "Julian," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "your actions constitute a clear and deliberate violation of Section 7 of your father's will, the Fiduciary Integrity Clause." He read the clause aloud, each word landing like a hammer blow. "Should any named beneficiary be found to have engaged in malicious, deceptive, or fraudulent actions, the offending beneficiary shall forfeit their claim to any and all shares of Sterling Designs, LLC." A collective gasp went through the room. Julian looked as if he had been physically struck. He stared at the will, then at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and utter disbelief. You planned this," he stammered. "No, Julian," I replied, my voice devoid of triumph, only a deep, weary sadness. "You planned your betrayal. I simply executed Dad's final design." My mother stood up then, her voice shaking but resolute. "What you have done to your sister, to this family, to your father's memory, it is unforgivable, Julian." He shoved his chair back, his composure finally shattering. He looked around the room at the faces of our family who were now staring at him with dawning comprehension and disgust. The trap hadn't just been legal, it had been social. In one fell swoop, his character had been irrevocably exposed in front of the very people he had tried to manipulate. He had lost everything, not just the firm, but his standing, his reputation, and his family. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving a stunned and devastating silence in his wake. The aftermath of the will reading was quiet and profound. Julian's dramatic exit felt less like an explosion and more like the silent collapse of a building whose foundations had been secretly eroded over time. My aunt and uncle, their faces pale with shock and embarrassment, apologized to me profusely. They had been so easily duped, so ready to believe the worst, and the shame was written all over their faces. I accepted their apologies with a simple nod. There was no victory in their humiliation, only a hollow sense of loss for the family trust that Julian had so carelessly shattered. In the days that followed, the full consequences of Julian's actions came crashing down on him. Without the expected inheritance from the firm, he was unable to pay back his lenders. His business, already teetering, collapsed completely. He was forced to sell his flashy car and his overpriced apartment, and he faced multiple lawsuits from the clients whose money he had lost. He had tried to engineer my downfall, but had instead authored his own. He left the city without a word, a man ruined by his own greed. I felt no joy in his ruin, only a deep, abiding sorrow for the brother I once had, and for the man he had chosen to become. My focus turned from demolition to reconstruction. The most important structure to rebuild was my relationship with my mother. We spent hours talking, not just about Julian's betrayal, but about the years of subtle manipulation that had led to it. She confessed that she had always found Julian's confidence intimidating and had often deferred to his judgment, mistaking his arrogance for competence. It was a painful but necessary conversation, one that allowed us to clear away years of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings. We began to build a new, more honest foundation for our relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than outdated family dynamics. Taking the helm of Sterling Designs felt less like an inheritance and more like a sacred trust. Walking into my father's office, which I had left untouched since his passing, I felt his presence all around me. I sat in his chair, ran my hand over the worn leather, and looked out the window at the city skyline he had helped shape. There was no sense of triumph, only a profound sense of responsibility. With David Chen's legal guidance, I formally assumed control of the firm. The staff, who had been worried about the future, were visibly relieved. They knew me, they trusted me, they had worked alongside me for years and respected my vision. Our first major project under my leadership was the Henderson Museum Wing, the very project I had been working on WH. And Julian first voiced his concerns. Winning that bid felt like a validation of everything my father had taught me. It was a complex, beautiful design, one that honored the past while looking to the future. It was a building about legacy, a theme that now resonated in every corner of my life. Months later, my mother and I stood on the construction site of the new museum wing, hard hats on our heads. The steel skeleton of the building rose against the blue sky, a symbol of strength and new beginnings. "He would be so proud of you, Andrea," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. I looked at the structure taking shape before us, a design born from my father's principles and my own vision. "I think he knew this is how it would turn out," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in a long time. He left us a solid blueprint. Julian's betrayal had been a seismic event, one that had threatened to level my entire world. But he had forgotten the most basic principle of architecture, a lesson my father had taught me as a child. A structure built on a foundation of lies will never, ever stand. I had survived the quake, and now I was ready to build again on stronger, truer ground. The grief for my father was still there, a quiet ache in my heart, but it was now mingled with gratitude and a peaceful sense of purpose. I had protected his legacy, and in doing so, I had finally found my own.